September 1st, 1939, Munich, Germany. My father stood at the window with the radio pressed so close to his ear that the cord pulled taut across the table. Outside, church bells rang like 100 small hearts trying to keep pace with the news. The voice on the Volksempfänger was careful and metallic, as if the words themselves wore uniforms. Germany had crossed the Polish border at dawn. My father's eyes shone the way they did when he blessed the bread on Sundays. "At last," he said, turning to me as though the world had been set back on its hinges. "At last, we are standing up." In that moment, I think he believed Hitler the way other men believe in God. Not as a politician, but as the answer to a question he had been asking since 1918. What do we do with our shame? He had been a private in the Great War, a trench ghost with a tin spoon and a photograph of a girl who became my mother. The armistice felt to him like being pushed into the street with no coat and told to be grateful for the cold. He blamed the hunger, the inflation that made a loaf of bread a joke, the men in grey suits who talked while factories died. When Hitler spoke, my father didn't hear threats. He heard a lullaby for wounded pride, order, discipline, work, belonging. We hung the red banner in the front room, just beside the wooden crucifix. The colors did not argue. They gazed down together, and my father's face relaxed for the first time in years. The city changed one poster at a time. Shiny boots kissed cobblestones, uniforms multiplied like winter coats, and broken pavements sprouted parades. A foreman from the party shook my father's hand and promised a position at the rail yard with better pay and actual hours. Bread returned to the shelves, and the sausage in the window stopped looking like a memory. I was 10 and learned to march before I learned to dance. At night, the radio became our hearth. It spoke of destiny, the way fairy tales speak of forests, dark, necessary, and inevitable. My father would adjust the volume the way a priest handles candles, then close his eyes. "Listen," he'd whisper. "He knows what we cannot see. If you're still with me, understand this before you judge him. He was ordinary, a man who wanted to be proud without hurting anyone. That was the trick of it. The way the story dressed itself. Pride came in through the front door, and cruelty slipped in behind it like a draft. By 1942, the city polished itself to a shine you could mistake for joy. There were flags for every season, speeches for every week, and posters whose colors made you feel as if your blood had been painted. I joined the Jungvolk and learned to fold shirts as sharply as I folded doubts. My father's shoulders squared with each radio bulletin from the East. He walked differently, as if the very act of standing was a patriotic duty. And when he passed the bakery, people nodded to him with a respect he had been starving for since the trenches. At dinner, he quoted phrases he'd memorized from the newspaper, phrases that fit into conversation like carved stones. The national community, cleansing, the will of the people. Words that sounded like home if you were tired enough. The cracks were thin at first, like lines in a pane of glass that you only see when the light hits right. A teacher disappeared. "Transferred," said the principal, straightening the portrait on the wall. The cobbler's son stopped coming to school, and the adults folded the subject into silence. My father turned the radio louder, as if volume could seal leaks. "We are rebuilding," he'd say, as if the missing bricks had never been part of our house. Once, walking home, I saw a line outside a brown building, no signs, no music, just the grey patience of people who had learned that waiting can be louder than shouting. When I asked about it, my father picked up speed and told me to keep my eyes on the horizon. In 1944, the war came home in the form of sirens so familiar they became punctuation. The first bombs took the roof of our tenement as neatly as a man might lift the lid off a pot. The second wave took the bakery and the bakery's smell, and with it, a piece of mourning. We spent our nights in cellars under a city that no longer believed in ceilings. My mother wrapped the good plates in newspaper as if words could protect them. My father still dressed for work by habit, combing his hair even on days when the factory was a smear. He spoke about sacrifice the way he once spoke about harvest. "Hold on," he told us, "and the storm will pass." The storm did not pass, but we learned to live under it. One afternoon I followed the smell of smoke to the synagogue that had been there longer than the school. It burned quietly, not a riot, just a tired house falling asleep in flames. Two men in uniforms stood watching, not proud, not ashamed, only present, like bad weather. An old woman wept into a handkerchief, the fabric of which had known gentler tears. I carried the image home in my chest and put it on the table between us, the way I might place a bruised apple. My father looked at me, then at the radio, then at the cross, then at the banner. "The enemies of Germany," he said, "have always wanted to poison our well." He wasn't thinking. He was drowning. He used the words as a plank. The night of the big raid, the sky over Munich became a mouth of light. We ran to the shelter with our documents and a loaf of bread that was more memory than meal. In the half-dark, I found myself beside Frau Stein, who used to press candy into my palm when I chased her cat for her. She was smaller now, like a photograph washed too many times. When the all-clear came, our street was a row of teeth knocked out. Frau Stein's address was gone. She stood in the ruin like someone who has lost her shadow. My father took my arm. "We must get home," he said. "There is looting." I slipped my coat off and placed it around her shoulders. My father flinched, not at the act, but at the word it suggested: disloyalty. We walked the long way back in a silence full of sirens that were no longer ringing. As the winter of 1945 unrolled like barbed wire, everything that had been an argument became a confession. The radio still promised, but its promises sounded tired, like a singer at the end of a long performance. My father's faith hardened into crust the teeth could not penetrate. He had believed when it was easy. Now he believed because the alternative was to admit he had been led and had walked willingly. "He has a plan," my father would say, tapping the set as if he could knock courage back into it. "He sees more than we do." The city grew smaller around him. He walked streets he'd known since boyhood and found that the corners had moved. Then the war ended the way a fever ends, suddenly with a coldness that made you shiver at the relief. Allied soldiers arrived with cigarettes and photographs. They spoke a language my father had been taught to hate, and a politeness that confused him. Posters changed faster than blood dries. The banner came down. The crucifix stayed, but the wood felt heavier, as if it knew what it had been asked to share a wall with. One day a truck stopped in the square and men set up a screen. We gathered because gathering had become our only habit. They showed images from camps with names we had heard as rumors and dismissed as the enemy's way of making us feel small again. Dachau, Buchenwald. The screen flickered in the pale daylight, and something older than politics looked back at us from the film. Bones arranged into people who were almost not, faces who had been starved out of having names. My mother cried without sound. I searched for composure and found none. My father watched with his jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscle fluttering like a trapped bird. When the reel ended, no one clapped, no one moved. On the walk home, my father did not look at the ground or the sky. He looked at the middle distance where a man meets his own reflection and tries to walk around it. "The enemy fakes things," he began, but the sentence died of natural causes. He stopped beside a lamppost that had survived the winter and put his hand against the metal as if to borrow its strength. "I did not know," he said. The words were small and clean, like fresh water. He tried another. "I did not want to know." That one fell heavier. It made a sound I have been hearing all my life. He didn't go to work the next day or the next. He sat at the table with his hands on the wood, an old soldier who had finally come across a wound he could not dress. I wanted to forgive him instantly, the way sons are licensed to forgive. Instead, I found a careful anger that took years to use up. We lived quietly. We traded slogans for shopping lists. Sometimes he would reach up to the patch of wall that had held the red banner, then catch himself and scratch an itch that did not exist. In church he sang too loudly for a few Sundays, as if to drown another choir that had taken up residence in his head. If this story moves you, stay with me through the part that hurts more than blame, the ordinariness of it. My father didn't love cruelty. He loved certainty. He loved belonging. He loved not feeling small. Those loves, put in the wrong hands, became a weapon he never meant to hold. Years later, when I was a man with my own quiet apartment and a habit of checking whether the radio was off twice, I sat with my father on a bench in the English garden. Spring had finally taken the city back from ash. Children chased a ball whose color did not care about politics. He watched them for a long time, then said, "I thought he was giving me my life back." He rubbed the coins in his pocket as if testing their weight. I did not see he was taking other lives to pay for it. I wanted to offer him a clear absolution or a clean condemnation, something that would settle the account. But the truth is messy. He was not a monster. He was a man who believed a beautiful lie because it made the world simple enough to carry, and when the lie required more weight than he had, he broke. Not all at once, not with a shout, but in a long, quiet collapse that looked like living. There are things I still cannot forgive. There are also mornings when I remember the way he held me during air raids, his palm over my ear to soften the siren, and I understand how complicated a heart can be. When people ask what it was like, I tell them this. In our kitchen, the crucifix and the banner hung side by side. That is the image I carry. Faith and fever sharing a nail. The day we took the banner down, the wall was lighter. The hole left by the hook stayed for years, a little dark mouth that never learned to speak. If you've stayed with me this far, here is the question I ask myself every time the world grows loud with easy answers. Would I have believed too, if the promises had come wrapped in order and music, if they had handed my father a dignity he thought he had lost? It is a frightening question, because the honest answer is not the one that lets me sleep well. We like to think we are made of better cloth than our grandparents. Perhaps we are just newer. My father died with a prayer on his lips that had no politics in it. At the funeral, I slipped a scrap of the old red cloth, a corner that had somehow survived the war, the denazification, the house moves, into the coffin, not as an honor, but as a witness. Paper burns, cloth rots, people forget, but the temptation to believe the man who promises to make you whole again, that never dies. It sleeps, and it waits for hungry times. If this story reached something in you, remember it when the next voice on the next radio gives you back your pride at someone else's expense. Remember the screen in the square and the sentence that died halfway. And tell me, honestly, quietly, without the comfort of hindsight, if you had been my father in that kitchen with a cross on one nail and a flag on the other, would you have believed him too? After the war, life in Germany didn't return. It had to be rebuilt from the ruins of what belief had destroyed. Our street, once a proud row of brownstone homes, was a skeleton of brick and silence. People spoke in half sentences, always looking over their shoulders, as if guilt itself might still wear a uniform. My father carried his shame quietly, the way he used to carry his medals, hidden but close to his heart. He stopped speaking about the Führer completely, as if the silence could erase the years of praise. When he walked past the bombed-out railway where he used to work, he would take off his cap, not out of respect, but as if he owed the air an apology. The Allies called it re-education. Posters went up urging us to face the truth, to build a new Germany. For many it was just another order, another slogan to obey. But for my father, it was a mirror he couldn't look into. He would spend his afternoons sitting by the window, watching children play among the rubble. their laughter echoing where propaganda once shouted. He'd mutter to himself sometimes, not words, just sounds, the kind a man makes when trying to remember who he used to be. One evening in 1946, a knock came at our door. It was Frau Stein's niece, the woman whose synagogue had burned, whose family had vanished. She had survived a camp and returned, thinner than memory, with numbers on her arm like inked frostbite. My mother froze, unsure whether to open the door. My father stood up slowly, took his hat, and stepped forward. He opened the door and bowed his head. "I am sorry," he said. The words were small, but they were everything he had left. She looked at him, at the man who had once crossed the street to avoid her family, and for a long time said nothing. Then she simply nodded and placed a loaf of bread in his hands. "For your wife," she said. "Bread is still bread." And then she left. My father sat at the table, the bread untouched before him, and cried for the first time in my life. Not loud, not broken, just tears falling into the cracks of his hands. "I was a good man," he whispered, as if trying to convince someone invisible. "I thought I was." Years passed. The rubble turned into scaffolding, scaffolding into buildings, and the city learned to pretend the past was a story that had happened somewhere else. I became a teacher, married, and tried to teach my students that history wasn't just dates and speeches. It was the sound of a father saying I didn't know when it's already too late. My father never went to the trials. He said he didn't need a courtroom to tell him what he already knew. He grew smaller with every year, as if the truth was still peeling pieces off him. When he died in 1957, I found the old crucifix in his drawer, the one that had hung beside the banner. It was wrapped in paper that smelled faintly of smoke and dust. Underneath it was a folded note, written in his stiff, fading hand. "Faith is not obedience, pride is not strength, I was wrong." That's all it said. No apology, no explanation, just the confession of a man who finally found words that didn't belong to someone else. Sometimes people ask me why I still talk about him, why I don't just say he was a Nazi and let that be the end. But he wasn't. He was a man who believed a lie because it was sung in the key of hope, and when the song ended, he couldn't bear the silence that followed. And that's the lesson I try to leave behind. Evil doesn't always come shouting. Sometimes it whispers in familiar tones, wearing the smile of a savior. It tells you that your pain has meaning, that your hunger has an enemy, and your anger a home. And once you believe it, it doesn't need to force you to obey. You'll obey because you want to. If you've stayed with me this far, remember this. History isn't written only by the victors. It's written by the sons and daughters of those who believed and learned too late what their belief had cost. So tell me honestly, if the world promised you belonging when you felt lost, if it gave your suffering a flag and your fears a face to blame, would you have had the strength to doubt it?